Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another podcast. Today we have Alex Wang. Alex Wang is a grad student at the University of Toronto, uh, in the and also a graduate of the engineering science program from the University of Toronto. Alex did various internships before, from Amazon and Honey, and has found an interest in doing research in artificial intelligence and machine learning. Alex, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, thank you.
So let's start off with your story because I know it's very similar to mine. Figuring out what you want to do with your education, your career, and it seems you've settled on something now, and it seems to be in the field of research, in the scientific community, and in machine learning, artificial intelligence. Can you tell me how you kind of where you started and how you ended up in the position that you are now?
Sure. I guess I was a pretty average kid. I don't know how far back you kind of expect people to go through this whole conversation, but I was a pretty average kid. Just went through high school, had decent grades, but throughout most of it, it's just kind of I always had this idea of trying to do something because it was difficult. Um,
So
it's
you
not like an
seek out challenges.
you could say it's kind of seeking out challenges, but in some senses, it is largely the same idea as when people say, oh, well, you slept 4 hours before the midterm, I slept two, right? In some sense, it's actually very similar to that, but uh, maybe I was just a little bit more stubborn than everyone else and I just wasn't really willing to back down. So I kind of just, saw it through every time. It's like, man, this is NSI is kind of a hard program within the fairly small scope of staying within Ontario, Canada, but it was oh, I'm just gonna keep chasing this. And earlier on, it was never really kind of what I was doing. I never thought too much about it. Just kept chasing whatever felt like it was interesting. But kind of went through that stuff, went through EngSci. Yeah, as you mentioned, we've been through fairly similar paths in that a lot of that autopilot led me towards software. I mean, growing up, I'd spent a lot of time playing video games as a kid, had a lot of interest in programming. So that was a very natural transition. Spent some time working internships for various reasons. It was mostly Amazon Honey and those kinds of things. But at some point, I had a research project I had to do for my fourth year. It's like a full year long course thing. And also, I had a or kind of a machine learning internship, and that was at Honey during my PY years.
And Honey is the browser extension, right? The
Yeah,
the one that finds you the promo codes.
specifically, yes. They
Right.
When I was there, they were expanding to a couple of other things. So one of the things that they were doing was machine learning recommendation systems. So just kind of producing an online and aggregate store which you can purchase stuff on. So at some point there, I had to implement a couple of models and do some sort of stuff like that. And mostly at that point, I started reading papers, and I suppose there's also a few other aspects that play into this, but it was pretty much just as I was reading papers and kind of sifting through things and having to step through math and proofs and theorems that people had written into their work while I was implementing them. It was like, man, this is probably the most or the best and most interesting application of what I've spent the last 3 4 years, well, 3 years studying in school at the time. And I'm like, wow, I really don't want to keep doing software engineering. And at that point, I just full on pivoted and was like, I want to do research. Um,
So you got into this. You said this is kind of like a greater, better application of what you learned in school. So was your coursework more focused on kind of the scientific field, the machine learning, or I guess I have to guess it did involve some sort of software engineering too, didn't it?
No, there was no software engineering whatsoever. We took one 200 level uh, basic data structures and algos class in third year, second term. And with the exception of that, we've done some programming, like introduction to programming in first year. We did a little bit of, and nothing else even remotely relates to software engineering.
Okay.
Um, yeah.
And
To
and
answer your
how did
question,
you find the interest in the field of like AI and machine learning in particular? Like, was it through Honey and like was it like let's say if you did some different project that also relates to your coursework at Honey, do you think it would have sparked the same interest, or is it something special about this particular field?
okay, so we did have some software engineering is one thing. We did have a little bit of relationship to AI. Um, my specific option in EngSci was robotics, so there was an introductory machine learning course. So there was that. I did do some of that stuff, and it did get me. I found it interesting, but it never really made me think that I wanted to do grad school, that I wanted to move away from software engineering. I think the big difference was the difference in work experience, actually. So maybe not. Coursework is coursework, and coursework you do because you need to and you would like to learn. But coursework and a degree is to some extent setting up your future career. And at no point did I ever really consider that a industry researcher staying in some sort of research or academia related career would have been anything I would have considered. And it was actually working in a somewhat research sided context that made me realize that there is a point of having spent 3 years doing entirely math, physics, pretty much based stuff, and that there was a place for it to be used, even if it wasn't like super directly, but the mathematical foundation and machine learning being fairly applicable to a lot of different areas actually allowed me to make use of my
Okay.
past time in school.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, for those who don't not familiar, how would you describe the difference between working at a software company like Honey or Amazon, and like what is the work difference between, say, a research like oriented job versus an engineering job? Like, what does the day to day look like different, and why did you like the research side more?
Um, I can give you my perspective. I would imagine it's very different from company to company and position to position based on your seniority or experience as well. But from my perspective, it was a few things. Software engineering to me was not or is very rigid and very clear cut. There's not a lot of ambiguity. The only ambiguity that I felt like I dealt with on like a day to day or even week to week basis was just how do I, like, at one point you have a few meetings here or there that are like, how do we architect this thing? What is our decision? What is our focus? And how do we like frame this topic or frame some sort of frame a solution for some sort of like feature that we're trying to develop, or some sort of like gap that we're trying to fill. And then after that, it's pretty much just you build through things. You cut tickets to services that you need access to. You write code and you like make sure it works. Tests,
Then it's
very
just a matter
methodical.
of grinding the feature out, just writing the code.
Yeah, it's the same. It's the same thing with a slightly different tweak in that it's just you have a grab bag of pieces that you can slot into a machine or into some sort of software that you've architected, and then you just kind of shoehorn each piece in so that it fits with the entire system,
Right.
right? Um, my experience in my specific experience in a somewhat research sided scenario was I wasn't doing research, but rather it was like, oh, we have this, because it was also fairly early stages in the recommendation system. It's just kind of these are some of the things that we have ideas that we're working on. Take a look, kind of pick through them, and then at, it's a lot less formulaic. There's a lot more of just like pull up some papers, skim through them, read through them, try to implement them and see how things work. Implement them the first time, see it work, see it not work, or see it not work, and then just kind of circle back. And in some senses, it's a little bit more like the scientific process. You're kind of evaluating why things are broken, like checking up as you go, and reevaluating why this solution may not have worked and where you might find a better one. It's
That
kind of
makes a lot of
that sort of
sense.
vibe. Yeah.
As the name suggests, it's breaking new ground. You're trying to find things. You're trying to search for things that work, things that don't work. Whereas in engineering, the like the classic example or the classic relationship between the scientist and the engineer is that the scientist figures out it's possible and then tells the engineer to go figure it out and build it into real life. And then I assume you much more prefer the scientific side of things other than making this possibility into a reality.
Yeah. We didn't do too much, or like it was a fairly small operation, so there's a little bit of the engineering too. Had to like learn how to process large amounts of data or whatever and see it work, because most of the stuff was still not on like small toy data sets or anything.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it was to some extent that like the things that I didn't manage were perhaps if they were to do live predictions on things, so like real time if somebody were to send in some sort of thing that we had to predict on, that we would like we I didn't handle any of that, and sort of like hosting a box that would, or like an instance of the model that would live predict, whereas most of the stuff that I'd been working on was kind of like offline and pre-computed for recommendation, I believe. some things along those lines. No, I didn't do too much, or that wasn't necessarily for the recommender side, but some of the other projects that I
I
worked on.
see. So now that you're so when did you start your grad school?
I started, I guess, about 4 months ago, September 2020.
Right. And how is that going for you? What is it like being a grad student, and how is it different from undergraduate?
It's an experience. There's a lot of things that are very different and always, or almost always, will be different from being an undergraduate. And there's some things that I think everyone will have a different experience in when in grad school. Things that are always like very different, I think, from well, not always, but things I think that are really different from being an undergraduate is that as a research student, you kind of have this aspect where you're working for yourself.
And what do you mean work for yourself? Is it like you have no manager to report to, or what does that mean?
Mhm. Yeah. So the big way I like to see it is everything in undergrad is pretty much driven by deadlines. Your prof has some sort of, or your instructor has a goal of teaching you some like amount of content. You have to fulfill some sort of instructional hours to be qualified to graduate. You need to fill some amount of and like you need to finish your assignment by like some time and all of these things. You have these things that are set out for you and they're prescribed to you, and you don't really kind of question. It's like, do I need to be doing this? What are my priorities or whatever? At most, you kind of have that in picking your courses, but you mostly run by deadlines given to you. Um, Whereas in my case and in research, it's like you might have some stuff imposed on you by like your supervisor, and they're like, oh, I need this done by then. In some cases, but in a lot of cases, and I think definitely in my case, it's just there's no one saying like, oh, this is something you need to get, or I want this done by then, or can you do this for me? It's just, and there's nothing to say, or yeah, and then
Is that because of like the open-ended nature of the work that needs to be completed, or is it just like a laid-back environment that is grad school?
well, there's no kind of standard for you to be measuring up to now, right? When you think of being an undergrad, you need to fulfill some amount of courses, you need specific credits to get your degree, and these courses are accountable for teaching you knowledge. So then these courses need to satisfy some amount of content and have like some amount of evaluative content to
Right. So
base
it's a
your grade
matter
on.
of requirement versus you kind of working for yourself. You really mean like how much knowledge or how much knowledge do you want to gain out of this, like personally? And I guess in undergrad, it's just like a matter of requirement. How do I punch this degree out from the school as soon as possible? Something like that.
Yeah, more or less. It's like when you say that your requirement for graduating as a grad student is pretty much is your thesis defended, and in some cases you have some course requirements, right? But the course requirements are like very light, and all of these things kind of are fairly freeform in how you get to them. And there's a lot of like fill time. If you were to only look to satisfy those requirements, you would be done very very quickly.
Okay.
And just sorry, I wanted to add on a little bit to that. Is the weirdest thing about it all is that then there's no sense of have I done enough? How do I compare, or have I done this kind of nebulous idea of a good job? Because there's really no compare, or there's no fixed outline, right? Anymore. There's not even a grade to come back to you most of the time, and all the feedback, if that we're all very used to as students, to say, oh, I've done good enough, and that's enough to call it a day and say I've done my job. It's not really there anymore. So it's very floating, and there's a lot of kind of uh, stuff to figure out on whether or not you think you've done enough, or whether or not you have done enough, and whether or not you're doing a good job, or you're actually like on a trajectory to bombing your time as a grad student.
Right. And I from now I definitely see what you mean by you're really working for yourself because you have less of these requirements that you need to like check off. I want to come back to the topic of essentially what you're learning or trying to learn, like machine learning and AI. It's such a big buzzword, and there's polarizing sides to AI, and there on one side I want to say is the people who fear this, doomsday theorists where they say AI is going to take over, a rogue bot is going to spread a virus, something like that. And there's people who say like all an AI does, it does basic things. We don't need to worry about it. It just helps us, and it's a very optimistic future. As a person who's deep into the field, what's your take on these kind of two polarizing ideas?
Um, I think, well, to put it quite frankly, the AI doomsday scenario is a very, very long ways off.
But it
My,
is possible.
um, not within like any sort of visible horizon. Uh,
So are we
I think
talking like 5 years, 10 years, like 100 years
no,
from now?
like at we no. It's like if you took absolutely everything in existence right now and cobbled it all together into this giant engineering project and then continued to glue it all together with like however many thousands of man hours of research, you probably would come together and get not very much, something that would like wouldn't at all look like a doomsday device or doomsday kind of AI type thing. Uh, I think one of the things that we're not really even at is it doesn't have this idea of abstract reasoning, um, and like to identify like symbolic objects. That's the level that we're kind of at a lot of those times. Similarly, things that like we see as people, it's like if we see like if somebody showed you a dog, you can kind of understand that it's a dog, and then you can see a different breed of dog, and these things would kind of make sense to you and keep like
Right.
generalizing off of these concepts. But
You see one
human
dog and that's all the examples you need.
To some degree, yeah. And it's just like, just as an example, there's this area of machine learning where, if you're familiar, it requires tons of data to teach a model to classify different things.
Right, and that's where the big data comes in, right?
Yeah, but then humans don't work like that. We don't reason like that. We can work off of, like, we can build concepts and symbolic representations of things off of very few examples. And there's this area where we try to reduce the amount of examples needed to classify things. Whereas a person can just you can just look, and of all possible things that you could ever see, you can pick out like pretty much anything that you're seeing. And in this setting where we're trying to use less data per example to teach a model to classify things, we're classifying maybe 5 different things total. So whereas a human is looking at everything that exists in the world, and you can just rattle off and label everything that you see, for the most part, within like as long as it's clear, uh, we can give a model and say there are only 5 options, and we give it like 5 examples of each. And if it's anything more, if it's even just like a picture photograph, on at best you're getting like 60% accuracy. We're not even remotely close to that. And when you look at that, it's just we're giving it a very specific task. And we're telling it to do a very specific thing. And there's very little cross communication between all of these different things that need to be done to like produce the thing that can actually interact with the world. If
Right.
that makes any sense. It's like if you're to think of like Terminator, right? You gotta have something that sees and understands what it's seeing. You gotta have something that's able to move and like actually stand against gravity and not fall over constantly. It needs to know the weapons that it sees. It needs to even be able to compute that, oh, that's actually a person and not just a rock or a mannequin or
Right. All the
whatever.
basic things that we take for granted is not obvious to these AI machines.
Yeah, we're at most kind of getting there, or not even close to getting there on each of those individual tasks, let alone having some sort of like reasoning about those things, reasonings to compare with what we see, how we can interact with those physically, what we would like those things to do, and so on. Like that future is not even remotely close to any sort of like time horizon we're looking at. That doesn't mean there's not some sort of AI related dooms, or AI. It doesn't necessarily stand to,
How
it's not
about
like
this? How about this? So I heard from many different kind of folks around different job markets, that a doomsday scenario doesn't have to be, let's say, like some AI, like a Terminator scenario where like a cyborg human shaped AI machine starts killing everyone with guns and bazookas and whatnot, but rather the another doomsday situation might be where AI takes over all the jobs.
yeah, yep,
And an example is, I think, a Canadian firm recently launched a trading stock trading algorithm that's purely based off of AI. There's like AI project management tools. Prices in Amazon websites are determined by AI. Where a doomsday scenario where all your jobs are taken away might also be considered a doomsday scenario for the job market. Uh, if we discount that the fact that AI can't do these complex tasks and learn like a human, but can do these like specific tasks, then how close is that doomsday? Like how close are we to like a say a job market doomsday in your thought?
Yeah. So I was. That's the other one to get to. Um, that's the one that's a little bit harder to answer. I don't think we'll ever necessarily have a doomsday scenario, um, because there's not really an obvious case, to me at least, of critical mass in that there's some kind of point or threshold or development that would allow this thing to suddenly shift the employability of people or the need for people to fulfill some sort of job area.
Have you seen Amazon Go? I think that's a grocery store that's you can there's like a bunch of cameras set up in the store.
Mm.
There's like these smart like checkout lanes that sense your phone in your wallet or something like that, and uses like computer vision to track what you bought and not like placed and like selected from the grocery store rows. Like cashiers, like where do you see that? Like would you think we still have cashiers and like staff in like 20 years, or do you think that's one of the like job like that's going to be replaced by AI?
I'm familiar with the idea, and that's kind of what I mean though. How old is that idea? Uh, it's probably coming up on like 10 years now, right? That Amazon's been trying to do this kind of cashierless physical store.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is, what are they at? Like 3 or 4 stores, and they're not stores that are meant to be turning profits yet. They're pretty much just test pilots or prototypes at this point still. And that's kind of what I mean. In that the economy adapts, and when demand falls somewhere else, there's supply in different areas and people get hired for different things, and overall economy, employment, all of these things are somewhat self-balanced. You can see the same as in like software engineering, because it's so hot recently, there are more and more people switching into it, and the net result is that like that area is going to require people. Just like similarly, you can kind of make this argument that Amazon Go and really building out these stores everywhere is probably going to require lots of technical talent. And that technical talent, as more and more of it's needed, the bar and the threshold to get in also maybe shifts a bit. So really, I think people kind of get pushed around, and human productivity as a resource gets pushed around even if it's not needed in a specific area. And that's what I mean, that there won't be a very quick uptake or quick sudden change in this sort of job market, and it'll take a very long time. So most of the times, these things will adapt. This
Right.
isn't this isn't independent, or this is I don't know, but this doesn't discount the idea that the wage gap and wealth inequality is a growing issue. And I think that one definitely exists. And it's definitely a more realistic problem. But I think a sudden doomsday of saying
Right. Maybe the
suddenly,
doomsday word is kind of invoking too much nuance, but it's
yeah,
rather
but
like it'll create disruptions in the job market and the economy and what kind of jobs will exist and not exist in the upcoming future.
yeah, but people adapt to those things. Maybe it's not always for the better, and that's a system that we as a society need to work out. For example, a lot of people kind of are out of some jobs as perhaps cashiers, but then how many jobs has Uber technically created? Even though it's not a good job and it's not very humane to be paying people to the way that they are, lots of people sustain themselves off of that sort of employment, contract employment.
Right. I had a pretty interesting question. Speaking of, different jobs and how they might be replaced and new jobs and whatnot. So basically, um, if you had, let's say you live near some Amazon headquarters or something like that, and you're going to get groceries, and there is one store, and let's say, the prices are the same, the quality of the groceries are all the same. One store has no cashiers, and the other store has cashiers. Would you prefer one over the other, and for what reason? And if you don't care, then which one would you still go to?
I think abstracting out the question to that misses a little bit of nuance. But if the only difference is cashiers or not, um, maybe today, given the scenario of COVID, I would go to the cashierless one. I think a kind of time sensitive answer to that. But really, the answer is it's not very important to me.
So how about this question then? So grocery store with a cashier, without a cashier, doesn't really matter. I agree with that. But let's say how long before let's say for like autonomous vehicles, let's say it's upcoming technology. I don't know if Tesla's leading the charge. They are definitely known for their autopilot system.
Sure.
How long before, and let's say like Uber develops no driverless taxis, driverless Ubers in the next like I don't know, 5 to 10 years. How like would you like how long before you would feel comfortable, like given your knowledge and like no knowledge of the landscape and AI these days, how comfortable would you be like getting on an Uber, driverless Uber, if it came out today or 5 years from now or 10 years from now?
Mm, I think I'm generally. I'd have to check the statistics about this. I would say that in most cases, I would be comfortable. Say this is like a regular city setting. I say statistically that it's favorable for me. Um, the scary part about a lot of these things is that you're not the person in control anymore when you're in this sort of autonomous vehicle. And whereas if like everything, the fear is that like it's barreling towards a car and you can't get it to stop, right? It's a scenario where a human would never make that mistake. And if you had control, you would avoid that scenario. But then again, humans are the people that have like failed judgments or like insufficient reaction times to save themselves in other situations. So in some senses, I would defer an amount of this to statistics. The reason
So
that
you
I would
trust the
defer,
data and you see, like, you just basically see your chances, like what would happen, like what are my chances of getting into an accident and hurting myself with a driverless car versus
the
an
average
Uber with a
driver.
driver.
Mhm. Yeah, the average driver. And really, I think in some senses that's pretty accurate, I think. Because they have, like, while machines have the potential to make, or have shown the potential to make some mistakes that a human never would, they potentially avoid a lot of scenarios that a human would definitely make a mistake in, or doesn't have the kind of facilities to make a judgment or reactionary maneuver fast enough.
Right.
Right?
So here's another question. So, if I had to choose between let's say an AI, enhanced grocery store or not, I would choose the AI enhanced grocery store. If I had to choose between an autonomous Uber versus a non-autonomous Uber, I'd do a 50-50. I wouldn't really mind. I would actually try the autonomous Uber just to see what it's like. And I would like take a picture that there's no driver in the driver's seat. But I had a conversation with another friend of mine saying, like a job of a pilot is also like highly automatable, because parts of the pilot, like the main bulk of the work is well, in the at least in the time sense, is getting from A to B, and that's already done by autopilot, the actual autopilot, not the one on Tesla. And the main job of a pilot is like, number one, communication, and two, basically, status check on the plane to make sure everything is going well. In that sense, it's another very highly automatable job. But I wouldn't feel comfortable. Let's say if I got on a plane, after COVID in 5 years, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, I would feel comfortable with a driverless Uber, but I would feel nerve wracked if I got into a plane and there was no pilot. You know what I mean?
I know what you mean,
But
but I
then,
also
but then the
know.
data suggests, as far as I'm concerned, or at least from what I heard, there's a lot more car accidents, per driver than there are plane accidents. So the chances are already in the favor that getting on a plane is safer, but for some reason, I would prefer the pilot. You know.
So that's interesting, right? Because that statistic is specifically what I've used a lot, like growing up as a kid. I'd like go to visit family in other areas of the world, and you'd always be kind of scared because growing up as a kid, I'd seen like kind of your Mayday TV shows about things that have gone wrong on flights, like flights stalling, things going wrong, turbulence, like various all of those things, right? And that kind of makes it scary, right? It makes it really real. But yeah, I'd always quell my own fears, and just statistically speaking, you're more likely to die in a car at any given time than you are to die in a
Did
plane.
you hear also this stupid fact that I tell people all the time, that you're more likely to die from slipping and falling in your bathroom, than dying through bullying.
Bullying.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this, but there's a lot of if we continue to look through statistics and kind of determine where we should focus our efforts into, where or what we should avoid, we should, everybody should have a bathroom mat, but that's not exactly advertised.
Oh yeah,
And
you
also
wouldn't.
another thing is, so many people don't know. So, for pregnant women,
Hmm.
it's important that you don't eat unpasteurized cheese, and it's
Hmm.
important that you don't feed your baby raw honey.
Botulism. I don't know the cheese one, but I know honey is specifically botulism, right?
Right, because
Yeah.
of the raw honey has the bacteria or something like that the
Yep.
babies can't process, or something. I'm not an expert on this, but those things are important, but I feel like it's, like cigarettes is like demonized in the public these days. Like, it's so bad for you.
Hmm.
And yet, on when I buy honey, no one's telling me, it's like, hey, don't feed this to your infant. If it's like less than a year or less than 100 days, you shouldn't feed this to your infant. I don't see that anywhere.
Hmm. I don't know. I don't know the statistics of how many infants actually develop botulism because of honey that they've ingested. Yeah, it's specifically botulism, which is the bacteria, the toxin is the same one that they use in Botox, produced by a bacterium that's in the same family as what gives you tetanus. But botulism is, or the toxin specifically, is a lot more lethal. I think it's the most lethal specific toxin any of that you can that has been discovered to exist, at least as of like when it previously encountered this fact, which was maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago.
So you should really put these labels on these raw honey. Probably get it from Whole Foods or something like that.
Well, depends on how often this actually happens, right? I don't know how many people actually know this knowledge and how many people don't. And how often does this actually happen? Because in how many scenarios are you feeding your infant honey, right?
Right.
Usually you're breastfeeding, or like they're either being breastfed or formula or something. I can't think of a ton of scenarios where it's like you should try to have the baby have a spoonful of honey, which I think is an actual thing to consider, right? And yeah, like
You
there's
can
there's
make your baby food sweeter.
but why? Right? The question is why. I don't know if
Well,
it,
I don't know.
like,
I never had a kid before, but maybe we'll find out. But all
yeah,
I'm saying
definitely.
is, there's things that go under the radar, which is a lot more dangerous than things that are red herrings and kind of things like that. And it's always interesting to see. It's always nice to know these things that fly under the radar. And it's like, hey, I knew that, and I gave that recommendation to someone, and they're like, oh, thank you.
Yeah, that's definitely like one of my hot takes. There's a lot of times where people, our generation and whatever in media, likes to sensationalize things that are not the most impactful or not the most significant things.
So,
Um, mhm,
okay, I want to come back to this topic of like your life story,
sure.
and kind of how you ended up in, you did your internship at Honey, and kind of your internship at Amazon. how would you like what would you do differently in the past 5 years, past 5 to 6 years, and like if you could give an advice to Alex 5 years ago, like what would it be?
Uh,
Because why I ask this is because a lot of people have struggle figuring out what they want to do with their lives, and you through I guess I don't know if you want to call it chance or by experiments or trying different things, you managed to find out at least to some extent what you're more or less passionate about. So like could you be more deliberate? Like like how would you reflect on that?
I think I was lucky. The honest answer is I think I was lucky. Um, if I think about it, one thing that I think I thought about and was always thinking about, even when I was in software engineering, was like, there's no way it's right that at some point I'm done studying math, right? At some point when I looked at my curriculum, I'm like, oh, I don't have any more math courses left. I was like, wait, this doesn't seem right. At what point am I done studying math?
Math
At some
never
point,
ends. That's
yeah,
the scariest shit I've ever heard.
I feel like I don't know anywhere near enough, and that it's just as much as have hated math at times, or think I'm not good at it.
Well,
It's
like
just
what's beyond like so like to the average public, like what's after algebra? Like I know there's calculus, there's integration, there's like you know beyond that, like what is beyond that space of math? Like what is there more to learn?
uh, I think it's only when you get into like 2 or 3 years into college or university is when math becomes useful. It's when you like differential equations is when you can start modeling reality. Um,
You know what I really wanted to learn when I was a kid is how to calculate bank interest and how the stock market works.
mhm. Those are
Something
like
I had no idea how tax works. I wish I learned that.
mhm.
I had no idea how I when I was side story. I don't know if this is like related to math at all, but I had no idea how credit cards work. So when I moved to Toronto and I had to open my bank account and apply for a credit card, I was asking the bank advisor so many like weird questions, obvious questions like how does this work? Like what do you mean there's an interest? Like how does this interest work? You mean I get interest on top of interest? Like how does that work? Right? And then, if and even at the time I already knew how percentages work, but not in the context of like real life situations, and I would totally have loved to learn that, but yet instead I learned how to calculate the volume of a random house or something like that. So honestly, if I learned that math in school, I would be down to learn that. But I have no
Oh,
idea what other kinds of math there is to learn that might be useful after like I know how to calculate my interest.
I think uh, in some senses I feel like that stuff kind of follows like the application of interest or um, like time value of money or all of these things. I think I kind of hit on those things, and those are applications of some like intuitive areas of math and this kind of abstract concept, uh, or on this kind of abstraction of reality or some sort of like not abstraction of reality, but this sort of constructed concept of money and time value of money and interest and appreciation of and inflation and all of these things. But I think, yeah, like wanted to answer a couple of questions here then. So then,
Like
yeah, the
so
things that
basically like
the other
what do you learn after like basic algebra, and where does it become useful, and should I even bother?
basic algebra, I don't know what you're gonna. I think that's a little bit of a difficult question to answer. What necessarily is basic algebra?
Like
What's
what you
math?
learn in high school?
Yeah, okay. So then, I mean, I'll kind of take it as up to calculus, like introductory calculus, differential calculus, and stuff like that. That stuff is kind of useful. But yeah, like calculus is in itself not super useful outside of its own kind of, or doesn't tie to reality very well until you hit differential equations. So differential equations is kind of like when you think, well, how fast does the water flow? Or like I have a mug and there's a hole in it, or there's something that I'm trying to drain like a fluid out of. And differential equations governs how fast you're actually draining it, because how fast the water comes out of some sort of opening in a tank is dependent on how much water is in the tank itself, and like various other factors like pressure and
Right, when you open up the faucet for the first time, it comes out fast because all the water pressure from the top.
Yeah.
But once it's like almost done, then it comes out slow because there's less pressure. So it
And then
models
it's
that.
yeah, and a lot of those times when you kind of build and understand systems, you realize that a lot of your relationships to compute actual behaviors of physical things is dependent on differential equations, and that's a point where math becomes really useful, I believe.
Do you think
Uh,
there's a gap in, the teaching of math where, like, I remember the first time I was learning calculus, and my teacher, who I remember still, very good teacher, taught me like physics and calculus. Said it's like, hey Gary, like, calculus, uh, it's not just about taking the rate of change of things. If you're able to find the optimum, like he told me this one example about how, if you know how to calculate the optimum, then like companies like Coca-Cola, or like how do you determine the perfect shape and the size of the Coca-Cola bottles, and how do you determine the caps, and how do you use like the least amount of material to make the most amount of volume, right? Like all of those things are used by calculus. And I wish like that was like a huge aha moment for me, because at that point I realized like, oh, like that's where you use calculus, like that's where you get, that's where you find the optimal values of things. It's not just about finding like, oh, here's the slope, here's the rate of the slope, like would you agree that, the gap is not, more math. The gap is actually the difference between, or the gap is between like where you use it in real life and what you actually learn in school.
I don't know necessarily, actually. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I think math needs to be learned, and I think you should know the foundations in the calculus course, for example, and like to learn the things that you need to learn. And in that course, it's not as important to be teaching you all of these applications, especially at a university level. And it's more so the challenge is not so much like take the Coca-Cola bottle example, right? In that sort of a scenario, the problem is set out for you, right? You're trying to get the most optimal like volume
Like
out
you
of
calculate the
out of
best
the amount of
shape,
plastic.
so you
Yeah, out of the
minimize material
yeah
for the best
amount out of the
volume.
amount of yeah out of the amount of plastic you use. But then you also need to like know how to formulate the problem correctly, design what you actually need, because when you think about that bottle, it's not just how much volume it holds, it's also its structural integrity, its visual appeal. Like when you say structural integrity, where is it going to have to be resisting force of? You're mostly stacking bottles, and they have to resist vertical force, whereas you won't be pressing them up against each other horizontally, right? So you need to like, I think a lot of those things is you need to also understand the problem and learn how to like design around them, and that's a lot of what engineering was for me. And I think that's kind of where you pick up a lot of these things. I don't know if it's super important to tie this idea of you, other than just like obviously people should be aware that optimization is a thing, but that teaching or spending a large portion of a foundational calculus course teaching how to use optimization is not something I'm sure should be done. And it's kind of funny because when you realize machine learning is entirely just a giant optimization problem in some setting, or in pretty much any setting, that's like awfully relevant. And also, um, yeah, yeah, I'd
I
say that.
see. So basically, the usefulness comes in when you can actually solve the bigger problem, which is, like for my specific example of the Coca-Cola bottle, is solving the peripheral problems and thinking about the problem itself. Like, how do we, like, where is this Coca-Cola bottle is going to be used? What kind of, requirements does it need to set out? That's the more engineering side.
And I think that's the point where the math becomes really useful.
Right, and then it becomes a tool which you can use to solve those problems, because you can't really go out and be like, hey, you know what? I think 2 centimeters for the bottle cap is enough. You got to use math for that.
Yeah.
I see.
And actually tying that back to your question of what would I change or what would I do again, or what would I like really tell my 5 year or myself 5 years
5 years
ago,
ago, yep.
it would really be just take more math. I think NSTAT was a great experience for me. I think I learned a lot from it, and I think being pushed in the way that I was, and having the people surround myself with the people that I did really helped me. But I think the only regret is that I didn't take math more seriously and kind of grounded my mathematical foundations better than I have. Um, by that I mean both taking more breadth and more depth in the mathematical courses that I took. Not that I had many electives, but also being a little bit more judicious when I'm studying for all of my math examinations and not learning things only long enough to get by for the exam, because I think having a mathematical foundation and also having like both that is well learned but also very broad and very deep, I think is the most important thing or the most valuable thing to come out with.
Mm.
And that's what I would tell Alex 5 years ago, really. This is again coming from a very tech skewed individual who's been living in an engineering bubble for the last 5 or so years. But that's my perspective, and that's kind of how the niche. And there's a lot of ways to get to where you want to in life. And I think the niche that I found myself in and learned about, I think that's the one that this sort of a lesson teaches me would help you thrive the most in this setting.
Study more math. I never thought I would hear that. Uh,
Really? Of all people, you didn't think you'd hear that
oh
from somebody
well, I would I would
studying
have expected
engineering?
to hear that from you, but studying more math is always boring. There's so many different. We often categorize math as one thing, but there's so many different like areas of math, like calculus. There's all optimization problems, theory,
Statistics, linear
statistics,
algebra,
counting, linear algebra, all sorts of things.
probability.
Yeah,
Mhm.
probability and things like that. There's so many different things, and personally, I think I would have loved that connection between math and the real world.
Mhm.
That's where the kind of engineering side is useful, is when you're able to, like, this so abstract. All of a sudden you have these x equals y and all these different things, and I'm like, where is x in the real world? And once you have this example where, like, hey, this is useful here, then that would have been useful for me. But I totally see your point about how, you know like, that's a engineering problem, and for other, other use cases where you're doing research and trying to understand higher level problems, different kinds of math can be useful.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I mean, I think I have a healthy dose of that. And when I try to think of where I got most of that from, it really was just all of my random math and physics, or my physics courses specifically. Heat transfer was like, well, I'm trying to cook a potato, and the rate at which this potato cooks is a function of the temperature of what's around it, but also most importantly, its thinnest dimension, right? In that the potato cooks like at the same rate in terms of how far from its outside it is cooked inwards, the same from all of its directions. So then for its center is most cooked when the nearest edge has, like, when the heat from the nearest edge of it has penetrated that far.
Mm, right.
So that's like one of those things, and like all of these sorts of like applicative areas of physics, which is in some arguments applied math, is when you see how this math starts tying into the real world, even quantum and, yeah, like as I mentioned, heat transfer, thermodynamics, control systems, kind of as well, and just all of these things are examples of how math effectively models the world. Whereas like the calculus 1 course, calculus 2, 3, linear algebra, ODEs, PDEs, and all of these things are served are best, like in my opinion, kept to fairly rudimentary applicative areas, and just making sure you understand all the rigor so then you can apply these things accurately and generalize well off of these concepts, and in the areas where you finally start using them to tie into real life.
Right. So, uh, I understand. So, coming back to, these applications, um, and your expertise, which is in machine learning and artificial intelligence, how would you describe the relationship between statistics and probability, and statistics in particular with machine learning and AI?
Mm, the relationship. How would I best describe this relationship?
So, like, would you, like, how, if I know a lot about statistics, do I know a lot about machine learning? Is there overlap? Is a good statistician can become a good machine learning scientist? Is it
A
about
good
probability?
statistician. a good statistician is more capable of being a good machine learning scientist than a good software engineer. I'll put it that way.
Right.
Uh, for starters, uh, yeah, I mean, like if you're a good statistician and all of these things, is you familiar with the idea that things are like statistical regressions, right? Given observations of reality, like what is your most likely outcome and what do you expect given some new example that looks maybe that there's the same form but maybe doesn't look exactly the same as some of your past examples, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's in one of the perspectives. Machine learning has a lot of different perspectives that you can take. Is one of it is just a statistical regression. What do you like? I've seen millions of examples of the same thing and seen all of their outcomes. If I'm given something of this, if I'm given the same like kind of categories of information, say like some of these, like I don't know, um, some of these like education, upbringing, and whatever, and like I wanted to predict something about them, like maybe their uh, expected lifespan. If you've seen like that much information, then you can kind of build an expectation of well, how much what I can expect the value to be for somebody else. I mean, I don't want to focus on any specific details, but it's just building a relationship between some set of inputs to outputs, and I mean that
So
really is one of the
right.
perspectives.
So going back to, like giving you saying giving advice to Alex 5 years ago about how you should take more math, is probability and statistics in one of those, additional math courses you would have taken, or is it
Oh,
still out of the is it a different kind of math courses you would have taken?
I would say just everything, really.
Oh, everything.
For starts, like I think, I mean, my specific case is like I think some of the branches of math that I'm missing are like a slightly better grasp. Or I didn't take partial differential equations. I didn't take too much in complex analysis. So those are two things that I'm missing a little bit. And yeah, statistics. I've only had one course in second year, and it wasn't very in depth. And I think that's the thing. Statistics and probability, which are actually often lumped together, like fairly different in a lot of scenarios when you think of what they actually are. Where statistics is kind of like the approximation of distributions and learning distributions and you don't really know them. Probability is literally the probability of things happening, which gets actually insanely complex from what I've
Mm,
heard. But I don't know because I never really studied it that deeply.
I see.
And as a consequence of that, a lot of the theory in machine learning is based around statistics. How can you make better theoretical statistical like bounds? When you take the expectation of your accuracy, how do you improve that? And like those types of things. When you really get into that theory, sometimes I feel like my math is lacking, which is why I kind of feel like taking math is almost always better. And so I don't need to scramble while learning how to be a grad student, learning how to study, learning how to drive my own work, read papers, sift through the unimportant parts, pick out the important parts, synthesize new ideas, all the while feeling like I'm also needing to pick up a statistics textbook and read through the whole thing, right?
So it's about
That's
learning the basic foundational knowledge, so such that when you encounter a new research paper or new publication, you can quickly gain access to the core elements, the key elements of the publication that is unique, and the key findings, if you will.
or just a new idea and you want to formulate it mathematically. All of these things, I think, rely on math because you can communicate it and you can reason with it when it's expressible in these forms.
What
So,
other skill other than math do you think is really important in machine learning, artificial intelligence research, the scientific community, or would you really say it's like math is the language, math is the kind of skill you need to have if you want to you want to be involved in the field of research, particularly in AI and machine learning?
it's risky asking me because I'm so early in this field, so I'm hesitant to say that my answers are accurate. But no, I mean, math is not the only thing. Math is, I think, often one of the hardest things to grasp because it takes the most time to develop. But I mean, as you mentioned, it is literally the language, right? And what is the language to do if you have no ideas to communicate? So I think there's a lot of kind of conceptual shift, like kind of thinking conceptually, coming up with
I like that
like
idea about how you express math as a language.
well, math is the language of science, right? And I think I've heard that so much that it's pretty much become mythology or like lore, like folklore to me, that it's a granted that science is communicated on almost entirely in math at this point, and I just take it for granted because I've heard that so many times. But yeah, I mean, it is the language, and at some point you need to be able to formulate ideas, and that's something that I think is difficult. But whereas you're not, and that's something that also needs to be learned, and problem solving and deducting and understanding problems, which in some sense is engineering, but that's also this kind of problem inference, logical deduction thing, and that's a lot of the times what you were trying to learn in grad school, whereas you're not really trying to learn the foundations of statistics in grad school. Um, so I think that's another important skill to have in this area.
But not, it's not like the be all end all.
It's not. I mean, everything has its times to be learned. With like, I guess what I'm trying to say is, math is meant to be, or math is best and most easiest learned in undergrad because it's kind of where it's expected to be.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always good to learn problem solving and framing and understanding and like logical reasoning and structured like kind of problem reasoning in undergrad. And engineering does a good job of that. But in a more specific case, to have the ideas to communicate with math in grad school and machine learning, you do still need to learn how to create those ideas. That's also kind of something that's best learned in graduate school
Mm.
topically, because learning it very generally is not always the easiest thing to translate.
Right. I have another question here, kind of, very related to what you just said. Between engineering and research, how much, and in your opinion, how much does creativity play a role in, like, let's say, let's start off with you as a grad student. Obviously, as, like an engineering student, I don't imagine, as an undergrad engineering student, I don't imagine a lot of creativity goes into solving, differential equation. Maybe there is small segments of creativity in finding patterns and different ways to solve a problem. But like, how much would you say how much would you say like creativity plays a role in becoming a successful graduate student, or is it really the matter of the ability to learn things and setting out your own goals and working for yourself?
I mean, I think it's big. I think in the long term, creativity is huge. Uh, in that's the biggest problem to solve. Whereas like your own productivity, working for yourself, your own mathematical ability, these are things that you kind of need to lay the foundation for. You can kind of see the end line of like how long you want to be working on these things in, like how much time you need to spend learning stats. How, like I hope, and generally people probably don't spend longer than like a year or two floundering and figuring out how to be a grad student, how to like think about working for themselves, right? uh maybe not, I can't really say for sure, but
Mm-hmm.
I think creativity is huge. At the end of the day, being a good researcher is about being able to come up with meaningful ideas, picking things to pursue, uh and just finding out and making meaningful explorations on like within some field. And what directs that in a large sense is your creativity, if you could call it that, right?
Right.
um
I want to pick your brain on this one kind of thought that basically the idea of the curse of knowledge, and for those of you who don't know, is essentially the more you know into this one thing, or one particular field, the your mind becomes your mind becomes very rigid and only thinks about things in one way, and less maybe even less creative. And there's like this idea of bringing young fresh talent into a team, is bringing creativity to the team. So like when you're a seasoned researcher, you're years into the game. um, like how do you continue to foster creativity? Is it like is it a lifestyle? Like what do you do? Like is it true that if you keep digging into the one hole, your creativity drops? Like what is your take on that? Like how do you like, the big problem I guess is, how do you like foster creativity all at the same time you're digging into this one hole very deep?
well, I don't know if I could give you the right answer again because I don't really know, right? um but I think, I don't know, I think I've already done that a little bit, right? I've already done that in the sense of I've been living in my engineering bubble for so long. And that's not necessarily to say that I necessarily know a ton in this kind of math sciencey area, but rather by living here, like, yeah, my perspective has definitely been skewed, and my approach to problems is very, very tainted by this idea of like, engineering problem solving, mathematical formulation, and all of these things. Um, does this happen necessarily to people as they kind of continue into research? Maybe, but I think in at least in the supervisors that I've worked with, it's not so much that they don't come up with more creative approaches to things or that like their everyday lives are super rigid, but that most of the problems that are engaged with are only really formulated in this sort of a manner. I think that's something that would be clear if I engaged with like kind of even more interfaces of uh, machine learning or my area of study and like more real life problems where it's just there's this super unclear and ambiguous problem of how to deal with it, and then by being very entrenched in some way of thinking or some area of work, that your default approach is already kind of narrow because of your experience. I've not done a whole lot of that,
Mm-hmm.
so I can't really say I have that experience. But I mean, if I were to ever make an idea or make a guess, it's just to keep your options open or keep your perspective open and to have friends and do things in all these other areas. Um, I mean, people that just like keep in touch with, spend time discussing problems, life, and hobbies, and all of these things with people that are not in the same field as you, or things that you're focusing a lot of time on.
That's a way to foster creativity, all in the same time while you're digging really deep into your your expertise in the research career.
Yeah, I mean, these things are hard, right? Uh, Actually, hilariously, the most prolific researcher PhD in my group, he just comes up with ideas out of nowhere. He's just like, oh, people kind of work like this, so I'm gonna try to apply this into a machine learning thing.
You know, you
And the
got to make
crazy,
those connections, right? It's like, how did you come up with that? You know,
yeah, it's just
some
like, hey,
people
this.
just function differently.
I just his thought is just like, hey, people kind of work like that. It's like, I don't know, like if you asked me what an apple looks like, I'd draw you an apple. I wouldn't try to say it's a. I wouldn't try to give you an equation for the curve of an apple, right?
Did he do that?
No, but like that's what I mean, right? It's just like if I were to try to communicate what something looks like to you, I'd give you an or I'd give you a drawing if I didn't have an image directly to show you, or I didn't have the object itself to show you. And just based off that idea was what my entire last research project was on. And just like he's just like, hey, this is kind of how people work, and that level of creativity is kind of cool, right? And I would argue that that's creativity, right?
Mm.
Whereas a lot of people are entrenched with it's like, hey, there's this algorithm that they used. I think I can improve it on this like thing. I don't like their second theorem, and I think there's a better way for it, or I think it's unintuitive, or it has worse theoretical guarantees than this other way to do things. Whereas this guy's just like, hey, this is kind of like people do this. People do this task better than a machine can, so let's try to have the machine do what people do.
Mm. Definitely really cool. Uh,
Mhm.
so I want to wrap things up here with just kind of briefly talking about what's next for you. So you've been in your grad school for about 4 months now,
Mhm.
as the time of recording. What's next for you? Is it a PhD? What's the plan? Like at least as far as you can kind of outline yourself. What are you thinking, and what do you want to happen? Like, what are your goals?
Hmm. I've answered this question a whole bunch of times, actually, hilariously. But honestly, the plan is that there isn't much of a plan.
The plan
Um,
is that there is no plan.
yeah, in that gonna like I'm not gonna pretend I can know what I want to do at the end of this 16 or so months that total I expect to spend in grad school. There's too many variables, and I just have no idea how I'll come out of it. I came out of my I went into my 4 years of undergrad thinking there's no way I'd go to grad school unless it was just like a quick follow up in masters. And then for the most 3 years of that, that was exactly what I thought. And going into PY and working, there's no way I was thinking I'd come out of this hating and wanting to go or going into grad school, right? That makes no sense whatsoever. But at the end of like as it plays out, at the end of that time, that's how that worked, right? So I'm not really gonna go and try to like think about what I want to do after my master's currently.
I like that. It fits into your previous story about how, you were trying different things, in Honey and Amazon, and you stumbled across, you said it yourself, you found this passion through luck, and I like how you're keeping it that way. You're just gonna like let things happen, and embrace the possibilities and embrace the opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really lucky to be in this position where I have this kind of flexibility. Uh, I think I would say I would love to do a PhD, and the big thing for me is settling it for myself that this is something that would be productive for me. But anything beyond that, and whether or not I think that it is my most productive option, whether or not things change from now and then, I'm not even going to try to guess at. And really, it's one of those things that when it comes to a point where I need to consider applying for schools, then I'll do it. And I think I will, because that's, I think, a likely thing. But at the end of the day, when time comes with whatever offers I have on hand and whether or not I'd applied to jobs and all of that stuff, when it comes to making that decision, I have no idea where I'm going to be taking it.
It's too
What
unpredictable.
what kind of perspective I'll have then, right? Because again, like me as I am now, my take is, yeah, if I can do a productive PhD, then heck yeah, sign me up. But me 14 to 16 months from now, 14 months from now, is that
You could
opinion going
definitely
to be
think of
true?
different things.
I'm not going to bet on it. Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. Well, Alex, thank you very much,
Yeah. Thank you.
and we'll see you again next time.
Hopefully.
All right. Bye now.